Which
Yeah,
which teams do you think have done it the best? Because we've just gone into a new year, and Valorant's kind of interesting in the way that the professional cycle kind of works, where you get
yeah,
towards that. There's these huge off seasons, so huge opportunities for, you know, players to change teams and new
sure.
rosters to be formulated. And we're in, you know, we had that first year of like VTT franchise where we moved over to the, you know, respective regional hubs, and now we're in like year two where I feel like what I've seen is teams have done a better job. I think
Yeah,
on average, and like trying to create teams and not just indexing for skill. So who do you think's done
sure.
the best? Like who have you been surprised by? What's been interesting you?
Yeah, I think for me, if we're talking about franchise teams, I think Sentinels definitely has made the right moves. Like my opinion of Zelsis, like regardless of how many times he tweeted about the Sent bundle, I think this guy is probably the most invaluable. Like he's so valuable to teams. I think he brings a lot to server work. I think he brings a lot. He's like a good vibes guy. He's always gonna lift you up. He's probably an insane communicator. Like I don't really know this about him because I haven't been with him too much, but like I think Sentinels did a great job. I know Kaplan personally, like he's an amazing coach. He's a great guy, and I know he's good at managing the personalities. So adding John QT and Zelsis, I mean, I think Sentinels is probably when it comes to off-season moves, I think they did probably the best job. What else? I think one thing to consider too is like I really like what Carmine Corp did too. I think like they took some risks. Like they picked up guys that I think traditionally mainly played duelists, right? Narrate, um, and I think Shin played duelist too. Like they just have really high mechanical ceilings, right? And I think like when you get together a team like that, you can and we've seen this before in the past too with this game. You have like this identity of being the underdog. You know what I mean? And I think that is something so powerful for teams to hold on to because I don't know, it's just something that compounds and snowballs when you get a little success. Like you're always hungry, you're always striving to be better. You haven't accomplished anything yet. And I think that's what drives teams to be great. Sometimes you'll see it's really hard to stay at the top for a lot of reasons, right? Sometimes you get complacent, right? But I think a lot of times, like I'm not saying Fnatic become complacent at all. I don't think that. But I think one thing that's important to consider is like how many teams are watching Fnatic VODs all the time to try to get better. You know, in this game, you have to figure out ways to kind of reinvent yourself and always try to strive for more and being and greatness and setting new goals for yourself, right? So like when you are a top team in the world for very long, teams will naturally just VOD review the shit out of you, and they will learn your tendencies, they will learn your strats, and all these things, right? So the interesting thing with this game is like the meta is always changing. It doesn't change a ton, but it does. Uh, but there's so many opportunities to be creative with the meta that I think are kind of slept on uh, as a result of the top teams really cracking the code with the way that they approach certain. So yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting. Like so the Sentinels thing is really interesting because they also did really well in the off season because they were one of the I guess like few super top teams that actually finalized their roster more or less like fairly quickly, and they were practicing and putting the work in. Actually, did well at the off season tournaments. And then continued that because with 100 Ds we won an off-season tournament right before the season started last year as well, but then the form just like dipped after that. So really impressive. I totally agree. And they have a lot of big voices on that team as well. Like there
yeah,
is the potential for like they've got like I think what could be like a problem that most teams don't ever run into, which is having so many voices that could take the
yeah,
wheel on the team. But they, like you say, they've done really well in finding a good balance. And I mean, we could probably talk about that for quite a while, but I think there's other teams that impress me as well in terms of I feel like doing a better job. Like Cloud9, I felt like did a better job. Like with the vanity version of a team, I feel like it's the best version of a vanity team that
yeah,
they could have with Oxy and so on. Just because I feel like in the past he was surrounded by players that were sort of too much. There was like too much of a mesh of like friend group slash
sure,
enablers in a certain
yeah,
sense. And now he's
uh-huh.
got more of a veteran presence on the team. He's the one that's like there looking after
Yeah,
Oxy and trying to guide him up as looking after him as the rookie. But also, it looks like he's sort of because he must have had some time to sit and think, okay, I might not be in tier one again.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I agree with you completely. I think his mindset, and I'm good friends with Ant. I think, and I've worked with him before. I think his mindset has changed. And I think you're absolutely right about the identity as like more of a role model, someone that's going to guide these younger players to success. Um, and I think that, yeah, you're right too. Like, cause he was tier one, he's always been tier one, and then he went to Shopify, right? Which is still a solid org, don't get me wrong. But played challengers, and sometimes you need a little wake up call, like sometimes that's all people really need to wake up. But I mean, when you're always at the top and nobody's really challenged you or pushed you out of your role, it's easy to kind of just like take things for granted, you know. So
Yeah,
I definitely, I
yeah,
think all the teams are in better spots though. Like they're all looking better, I think,
yeah.
which is nice to see because the skill level is getting higher too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like yeah, we can spend some time talking about some of the teams. I think Leviathan was another really interesting one
Yeah,
because
yeah,
they get calm. You've got Aspas joining that team and also a new coach as well. So they really changed a lot of pieces, but
yeah.
looked great coming out
They
of the
did.
gate.
They did. I think with them, they have so much mechanical skill with like, especially um, like King, Tex, and Aspas when it comes to mechanics. Jesus, dude, these guys are nasty, right? And then you got Calm with playing initiator. I know he's a great, great communicator. I'm sure he's like another. He doesn't have the same exact vibe as Zelsis, but I think he's like a vibes guy. He's bringing good ideas to practice. He's just a good teammate. But I think the difference between those two teams is just like Sentinels had the entire offseason to kind of really iron out the kinks, right? And I don't think Lev had that time, right? So I think you'll start to see these teams really start to figure it out. Maybe not right away, but in the next month or so. You know what I mean? They're gonna start. Like I'm excited for the matches after. It should be some really, really good stuff.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I
Yeah,
totally agree. Because yeah, Sen were a team where they did have all that time, but like you say, yeah, most teams didn't. And I think one of the question marks always will be the question mark for people, I suppose, is going to be 100 Thieves because they have always so much attention. And obviously, you got to work with some of the players. And I'm curious what your take is on the decisions that they made and sort of the direction that they're moving in.
yeah. I think I like 100 Thieves moves. I think adding Boostio was like probably the best thing you could do for that team because I think they needed some type of emotional leader, and I think he brings exactly that. He's a huge vibe guy. He's got the experience. He won champs last year. He brings a lot of experience. So getting him and Zix over from EG, I think was really solid. I think they just also are another team that need some more time. Um, and yeah, it was interesting to see actually Matt on smokes to go with like the demon one approach. I think it's
Yeah.
viable. Matt's a good player. He's a crisp aimer. I've actually, dude, watching Matt was so crazy. Like seeing him live, looking over his shoulder. I've never seen a guy hold angles so tightly before and look so relaxed. Like he's just so stoic when he's aiming.
And that's cryo for those
Um,
of you that,
yeah, cryo.
yeah.
Sorry, yeah. So it was crazy. I'm watching. I'm like, why can't well, what happened to me? What happened at birth where I just couldn't do that? Um, but yeah, I think a lot of the teams made really good decisions when it comes to players.
Yeah,
So
it
I'm
does
I'm
feel like
excited.
that. I think
Sorry.
the ugly duck, I suppose, is maybe forever going to be EG. Obviously they're in like we're in such a weird spot, obviously with everything that happens.
Hmm.
And for those of you that don't know, I'm sure if you're watching this, you're a Valorant fan, you probably know. Obviously, EG they won champions last year, and then the entire roster effectively got nuked into oblivion for various reasons. And Jorgamo is the only one that remains in terms of the players on that team of that original roster that won champions on EG, and they've of course they still have the same coach Potter. However, Zix was the assistant coach working with Potter previously, and is now, as we were talking about, is coaching 100 Thieves with Boostio. And is that kind of Boostio a little kind of I suppose combo, and that's really important.
Hmm.
And that's really important having that sync between the in-game leader and the coach. So now you've got a completely different roster for EG, and the expectations obviously very minimal from pretty much
Mhm.
everybody. And I think they definitely, with their opening debut games, certainly probably made a lot of people kind of say, "Hang on, is
I
Potter going to
predicted
do
a
this
win, by the
again?"
way. I predicted a win, by the way. It's somewhere in
Nice,
Sean Gare's chat. It's somewhere deep,
nice.
deep in the VODs. Um, but yeah, yeah, people were definitely surprised by that, I think. But again, I think this whole identity of the underdog is so important, and that team definitely has it, which is crazy to say because they just won champs, but a whole different roster, right?
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, I think that whole identity with underdog, and I think Derek's on his come. I love Derek. Derek's on his comeback tour, right? He had some solid. He's like LCQ form, got some clutches. Jagamo's insane. Nature was a player that I was looking to pick up with OR, but then he went to go play that tournament with 100 Thieves, I think, Japan.
yeah,
Um, and then you got Poet, well, no, Superman, who's just a really good, solid player, and what, Apoth, right?
yeah, 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 yeah. Apoth,
Yeah,
yeah.
good team. The team, the players are so good in this. So good. It's about getting the right personalities together. You know?
It's really interesting because one of the things that I think both maybe I think maybe Zix kind of referred to this multiple times. Maybe Bustio as well from the 100 Thieves camp is sort of just saying how kind of trying to brute force this approach a little bit of just like, guys, we just need to like swing more. You just need to fight more. And
Mhm.
and obviously we'd worked with 100 Thieves with the previous year, and the team definitely got way too passive for sure. And it is kind of a little bit because of the combination of players, just styles. And that's not to say that you can't make that work, but that's like one of the dangers of it, if you're unable to kind of like fix that. And so they're kind of like brute forcing that a little bit. And I know Derek got really kind of suffocated by that too, because he was in this very, very, very supportive role, just kind
Yeah.
of playing info on Sky, and like in most cases. And I think he felt like very isolated as a player, unable to kind of connect to the game. And so you're seeing him do the same thing as like 100 Thieves are trying to do now with this new roster, where they've identified this issue and they're just trying to really fix it by just getting everyone used to taking, like, testing those limits, feeling confident, taking those fights, because they're all sick players. And then you've got Derek now, who's doing that on the EG roster. He said to me, and I'd like a similar viewpoint to you, because I kind of had that inside info because I spoke to Derek briefly, and
Yeah,
he
yeah,
was like, Dan, it feels like 100 Thieves 2023 when we were no wait 2022 when we first made
yeah,
the roster, like it feels like that. And that's the vibes we have. And if you look at how he's playing, yeah, that's the Derek from 2022. So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
totally different.
I think one thing that's super important in esports, especially with these tier one teams, is just this concept of identity. Like I think when teams have this kind of passive identity and they don't take fights and they let the other team run their game plan against you, it can be really, really detrimental to your success. Like you have to in this game, you have to take risks. You have to play disruptively. You have to make people deviate away from their plans. And when you play too cookie cutter and too fundamental, it can really hurt your chances. Which is kind of funny to say as a coach. Like, you want people to play fundamentally sound, but really you want them to be able to do that when the win condition is more so in your favor. You always want to have this reading of the scale, this internal voice in your mind throughout the round.
It's really interesting actually, because there's almost this. I think if you look at how EG won last year, I think there's a lot
Mm.
of interesting things there, that come to my mind. Like, for example, there's Derek was sort of describing that Potter's approach as a coach is pretty different, honestly, to most other coaches. It's less like nerdy in the way that you're talking about. Actually, it's more about sort of enabling the teams and being able to play loose, but be structured in the right places, but not really overcooking that.
Yeah.
And it's, if you looked at the final form of EG when they won champions last year, that team was so dynamic. And that's not stuff that you can scrim for, essentially. Like, that's, I mean, yeah, this, you can obviously have certain plays that people understand and so on, but every player was just, it was kind of that like lightning in the bottle stuff that, yeah, that's what you get when you have a team that wins a championship. All the players like know what the other one is thinking, and they're all doing stuff that maybe they haven't even done before, but they just all put the pieces together. I'm in this spot, you're in that spot, this is the situation, the map, I'm going to do this, I don't even need to communicate it, it's happening already. And we're just like, we're all in flow at the same time. And it almost
Yeah.
feels like Potter's approach with the team there was able to enable that kind of action. And I wonder if there is a degree of like overcooked sometimes with certain teams, because we did see this with some teams last year, that the players get kind of too that they're too frozen out of like being dynamic like that and getting the confidence in that way.
Yeah, I think for sure, definitely. Like I think, like it's funny. I was talking about earlier the whole idea of disrespecting utility in scrims. I actually think disrespecting utility in this game gets so much value, and if you can have players that have the balls to do it in matches, right? Like I think a big thing for EG is I don't think any of those players were nervous. Like I genuinely don't think so. Like I know Ethan's been playing the game. I don't even know how long, right? I had a hairline back when he was playing pro. Like that's how long it's been, right? Jogamo, I don't think the guy gets nervous. I just genuinely don't. Just from watching his stream and just like the way that he's just living. Who else did they have? Demon One. I don't think the guy gets nervous. He's like the most confident player in the world, right? You got Boostio. I genuinely, yeah, like I don't think there's any nerves there at all, right? And then who
Yeah.
am I missing? Calm. I think Calm is like the guy that's like just like doing his role, just keeping it all together. You know, like being very supportive and being very vocal and kind of like tying it all together. And maybe him and Ethan are the guys that are kind of like making sure the team's not overextending in certain situations when the round is already won, right? But I think, yeah, I think those guys. One thing for them was like they had a set strat for almost any combination of ults. Like I'm thinking about
Yeah.
their fracture map, and I think like that was really cool to see because it always felt like their ult plays got value, you know. But then they were
Yeah.
also very good at like controlling the orbs and slow and but then also being super disruptive around the orbs on defense when they needed to. So I don't know. It was like a healthy balance, and I think at the end of the day, it was like they were just not tense at all, and they were super loose. Whatever call was made, they just ran with it. There wasn't a lot of hesitation, and then they just ripped it. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot to be said for that. I remember I wrote this like tweet back when they, I think before champions, but it was like clear at that point that they were like an absolutely insane team. They were like hitting that form. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of the tweet was like, EG's good vibes are a competitive edge, and I kind of went into
Yeah.
like the physiological like basis for that, because people don't normally talk about that, but like if physiologically what happens when you experience pressure, especially like high levels of pressure, is there's these
Yeah.
physiological things that happen. You've got these, like
Cortisol
cortisol
and
and
yeah.
adrenaline, like all these things are flooding into your system that can be pretty detrimental if you don't have like a good, good vibes on the team. Because if you're in a really stressful situation and you've got nothing to kind of counteract the negative aspects of that stress, because the stress, like the adrenaline and the fight or flight, can enhance your performance. But if, let's say, the whole filter is negative because people on the
Mm-hmm.
team are negative, and so on, then it's going to quickly go to like the crash, like you're kind of indicating. And having
Yeah.
like really good vibes, it has the same kind of like physiological result where you get like good, like other good chemicals, like like let's say like the team feels really good and everyone's kind of in this
Dopamine and
environment, like dopamine, like oxytocin, like all of these other
mm-hmm.
things are happening where it's counteracting that all of the negatives. So if you can have that, you create more resilience emotionally on the team. And like you described, I think they by far were the most resilient team. And it's funny because you actually were describing all of the players on the team, and you didn't actually mention you didn't mention to Ethan till last, and you gave him like the smallest description. Whereas like that's
Oh
how
well,
like
no,
crazy the team is. Oh, you're saying
I
first?
said I said that he had so much experience, so
Oh,
like he's
okay. My
unfazed
bad.
by anything.
Okay, my bad.
But you're right. Like Ethan is insane. Like Ethan is from a support standpoint, like in the like when I watch this guy play, the util that he throws, Jesus, I don't think it really gets any better than like especially when he's on KO. Um, I mean, this guy is like you can count on him for at least 20 assists pretty much every game on KO. Like it's pretty insane, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, like he is very very good, and I think NRG are in a good spot to improve. That's another team where it's like geez, like another super team, right? For them, it's like, okay, can we get all the personalities to mesh again? I think that's the big thing for them.
Yeah, yeah, it's going to be really interesting. It's so fascinating because you have to ask yourself the question, if you're a pundit of Valorant in any sense, you have to ask yourself the question: how did we all kind of miss EG? Because obviously, like for EG to make it, it obviously was like the circumstances were ridiculous because we had the situation where 100 Thieves had to lose to MIBR, where they had the coaches stand in, and it's
Mhm.
like, oh, that situation in of itself was absolutely wild that happened. That should never have happened.
I'm glad I missed that part.
Yeah, 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 right. Of course you weren't there for that. Yeah, that was, and so then that happened, and they get in, and it's like it's just at the moment when, for whatever reason, everything's click starts to click on their team. And so, how was it the case that it just, how was that transformation possible? In that fashion, it's
Dude, it's
crazy.
crazy. It is crazy. Like the older I get, the more I realize that just like timing is everything, you
Yeah,
know? Timing is really everything. And I think like when you create a team that has a good culture and the vibes are good, anything can fucking happen. That's just what it is, you know?
it's crazy. It really is crazy.
Yeah.
But we should go over some of the challenges teams as well. I'm
Sure.
curious what your
Sure.
take is on at least the Americas teams.
Hmm.
With challenges there, obviously, I think the setup has been going into the season for pretty much everybody because of what we saw in the off season. Okay, yeah, you place Oxygen at the top, you place MXS at the top, and they're the rivals, and their rivalry is awesome. And then you've got MAT who had their debut today, actually,
I'm gonna check
started
that
soccer.
score right now. They won 2-0 today. They won 2-0 today.
Nice, there we go.
So
So
13-11 on Lotus and then 13-6 on Icebox.
yeah, it's actually quite interesting because for some reason this only just dawned on me. You have Happy, who is now,
Hmm.
as has been the coach for MAT for a while, but he's
Yeah.
coaching an Iron Game leader that is Nitro. And for those of you that aren't from Counter Strike,
Hmm.
Happy played against Nitro many times. Happy was one
Yeah.
of the best in-game leaders in the French Counter Strike global offensive scene for a very long time. So they were rivals because Happy was with Envy and so on, like won majors. Like this guy is like was an extremely talented player
Top of the top.
individually as well
Yeah.
as a thinker and an in-game leader. So that's actually an interesting dynamic that I hadn't really thought of, and so I'd be really curious to see
Yeah.
what that
Yeah, me
relationship's
either.
like.
I think that team is just enough. I think that team has been slept on a little bit in the off season because they haven't really been playing events. You
Yeah, they
know,
haven't been in
a lot of
anything.
people. Yeah, a lot of people forget that this was the team that played against G2 to qualify for franchising last year. So this, I mean, obviously there's two changes here. BCJ has been brought in, who is amazing. I mean, I know I've brought up like 4 or 5 players now that I wanted to pick up on OR, but BCJ was one of those. Like he is a guy. One thing that I didn't talk about earlier when you were asking about like things that I'm looking for in players, I want players that have something to prove, you know?
Yeah,
BCJ is the epitome of that, right? Like he got shafted out of the EG spot, right? I don't know exactly what happened, but ended up going to the reserve roster and then couldn't get opportunities elsewhere. I'm not sure exactly why. Um, but I mean, this guy is a top tier communicator. Every single day of scrims when he's trying to make things better. He's trying to optimize. He's communicating with his teams. He's dictating post plans, talking about how they should approach like the mid rounding and stuff like that. So like BCJ was another player that I was super super high on that I wanted on OR. So I think that, like he's an amazing push like pickup, and Xander and I used to be teammates CS, which is funny. And I'm really proud of him. He's done a great job. He played actually really well today. Let's see, he went 41 and 29. Um, so Xander's a good guy. Like I know all of these guys for the most part, outside of Kuala Noob and Nitro, but like this is another team that can get it done, right? And yeah, so I don't know it. The challengers teams, I think really it's OXG, Moist, and I think M80 are the top three, the obvious ones that people are kind of going with, and I think a lot of that is just like OXG and Moist. I think have been together longer as a core, right? And so they're
yeah,
kind of, I think of them kind of like the Sentinels of challengers right now. But I think it is possible for a team like Mady And I even think like sad esports has like lots of dark horse potential um, to kind of make some noise. So I think, and who knows with this TSM team? This is another team that's early. And then I got my boys, like some of the OR guys that I'm rooting for. Together we are, what is their name? Together we are terrific, which is an interesting acronym. But yeah, so there's lots of and then the YFP has a couple OR boys too. So it's going to be an interesting season. I don't know who's your favorite. I think for me right now it's probably still OXG, even though they lost
Yeah.
yesterday.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's really difficult between. I mean, obviously you're competing for one spot, so that kind of makes it a little bit even more tricky in a sense, because I do think that rivalry, again, for those of you that aren't familiar with this, like when you're competing, like metas can develop in within a rivalry that can get pretty weird. And so it can be the case that you can have a one team that's maybe like on the rankings, maybe even actually quite a bit better in various metrics than another team. But if those two teams have played each other a lot, especially in a competition environment, like all kinds of weird metas can kind of come about that are unique to that matchup. And what that kind of means is that you almost create this world where you're playing like almost off meta spots, which become more plus EV very specifically in that matchup, just because you know the player tendencies so well. And
Yeah.
if you think about a given match, and we talk about, let's say, conditioning, as part of doing a good job as an in-game leader, trying to conditioning, controlling the options of your opponents, these types of things, and that happens in the vacuum of a match. In rivalries, sometimes it carries across matches like in a pretty deep way.
Yeah.
And the only thing that's comparable to that outside of this example is when you have VODs you can review on a team where you pick up some of their tendencies, but it's kind of and you can kind of anti-strat a bit. But this is a bit different. It's a little bit different when all the players have experienced it, and you've got one player playing against who's used to playing against another player, and like they have like a spot like where they play against each other quite frequently. There's all kinds of weird things that can happen, and it makes those rivalries really exciting because of that fact. And so even if, because I'll say that I agree with your and this is all to say that I agree with what you're saying about Oxygen being, I think, the better team overall, but I do think that they could lose even in an Ascension Grand Finals against MXS because of that factor, and also because MXS are amazing as well. They're very good team, very good players.
They are. It's the other thing too is I brought it up earlier when I was talking about Fnatic and how Fnatic is getting like hard VOD reviewed by all these teams. They're taking stuff from them. I think you could almost say the same thing about Oxygen and Challengers. Like,
that's true.
People saw what they did in the offseason. They're kind of dumpstering these tier 1 teams, right? The only team that I think beat them was Sen.
Yes, yeah. And now that has even more meaning to it, given how good we can see that Sen actually have been.
Like, I actually think Oxygen might be a top 4 team. No, I'm not even kidding. Like, they're that good. And I like Bonkar is a fellow Swede. And he's got them lined up, and so it'll be an exciting season. I think those are probably my top four picks. But I can't agree with you more. Like these series, like they played each other how many times in the offseason? I don't know, like 3 or 4 or something like that.
I think 4 maybe. Yeah, it was a bunch of times.
So
maybe 5.
When you start to realize like tendencies, you can understand when teams are running said default, and then it really just comes down to like how you react in the moment. Can you deviate away from what you've done in the past and get value out of it? So like you're saying, playing suboptimal spots that are just naturally higher EV because you haven't done it before, so it is interesting. But I think that's one thing that's it's hard for just your casual viewer to pick up on things like that unless they are an addict at just watching and consuming the games.
Yeah, it's fascinating because when one of the reasons why the thing is I don't have as much insight, I think, into the way that MXS are internally as I do Oxygen, so that might be part of my bias too, because I spoke with Dapper. I did a podcast with him that a lot of people were watching. I think it goes back to something you said. Dapper's very hungry, and all of these tier 2 teams, especially ones that we mentioned, like M80 as well as MXS and Oxygen all extraordinarily hungry for the win and
Yeah.
for the ascension spot. And Oxygen have that, but what Dapper was describing in his team was like all of these like amazingly high quality culture things that like you described a lot of it already about just how driven the individual players are, like how they hold each other accountable. We talked about like scrim quality, and the scrim quality that they have is extraordinarily high, and you can see
Hmm.
this. Like if you have the eye for
Oh
it,
yeah.
you can see it, because when you watch the matches, you can see like these like little spots where, especially a tier 2 team, you wouldn't expect them to just play the optimal thing just because they should, because there are spots in matches where you can chase that frag. And but they're so it was so obvious to me that they're so religious about it. And then when I spoke to Dapper, he's like, yeah, we have, this is the thing, like we have a thing where we try to play as disciplined as possible, and they've got a whole like reward system within the team now, which is like self-propelling, that everybody
Hmm.
wants to hold each other to that standard because they understand that's like how you win. And because of that, that to them is more satisfying than going and getting that kill. And that's like, that
Yeah.
is, you've hacked the system at that point. You've rewired
Yeah.
the reward system, and that is like very hard to do. But they've done it.
It is, and I think that you said it best at the end there, right? If you can rewire your brain, the reward system. I always think like if you can figure out a way to make the other team feel helpless in the round, helpless and hopeless, like they just literally can't do anything to win the round, you know? Like that is what you should get the most satisfaction from,
Yeah, it feels so
you know?
good.
If it's the best, like, oh, you're actually there's just eons between us. That like we're not even on the same level, you know? You had zero chance at winning. That for me naturally, just like as a competitor, I always loved that. I grew up playing, I was a 3 sport athlete all through high school, and so that's part of the reason why I like stuck with gaming, is one way that I compete still. You know what I mean? I don't want to go to the gym and play basketball. I mean, I go to the gym, but I don't want to go play basketball and tear my ACL and be bedridden for 2-3 months. You know what I mean? So like this is how I compete, and I love competing. Um, so that's like the ultimate satisfaction. Is like when you can, the other team like taps out, it's like, ah, shit, I had no chance. I can't do anything. These guys are so good. They're so disciplined but they're taking risks at the start of the round, right? They're understanding the win condition. They get the win condition, and then like, you'll see it all the time when you watch these players. Like literally, they get a kill, they instantly pull their knife out, and they just leave. Like they're like gone. All right, like I'm not getting traded. You cannot kill me. I'm living. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you'll see it. It's just these, and really these things are cultural things that are talked about before. Like these are things that have been instilled in players for months. Like you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these other teams haven't had that conversation yet. And really, it takes some time to get there. And with a lot of these players, they've played challengers last season. That's why it's really hard to see like a team that is coming in this season overtaking one of the top three in my.
It's really interesting because it actually, when we're talking about that scenario of how satisfying it is to outplay someone where they don't have an option, like they've got like no chance to win. There's no
Mhm.
fight that they can take that's
Yeah,
anything except like the most horrendous fight ever, and everything to them, like the feeling for them is, oh, it feels bad. Because one of the ways I describe like intuition as well is like, because it's hard for us to, we're unable to do consciously all the like the pattern recognition, all the math that's going on in our brains.
yeah,
And
yeah,
but sometimes we just like, it's like how you hit a timing, right? It's like
Mhm.
like, but
Yeah,
how
yeah,
do
yeah.
you know? Like, you don't know. Like, you can't explain it to me. It's like when you throw a ball. Like when you throw a ball, your brain is doing trigonometry, but you don't know how. You probably don't forgot trigonometry if you even learned it in the first place. Like, when do you ever use trigonometry? Your brain does
Yeah,
it
yeah.
automatically, and that's kind of like this intuition element. And so when you are like putting your opponent in this spot where it just feels so awful, and you know how it feels to them, and they're so shut down and suffocated,
Yeah.
that feels amazing. I totally agree. But when you
They're going
describe
down
that,
and you're going up. Like
yeah.
it's like the gap just gets bigger and bigger.
And because you know exactly how it would feel to be in their spot, and it
Yeah, yeah,
reminds me
yeah.
of like we were talking about ranked earlier, right? And there's a lot of people that will try to, when they don't know what to do, they'll do this thing for the wrong reason, which is to like ego swing because they want to get their
Yeah,
confidence
yeah,
back. And I just
yeah. Mhm.
when you're talking about that this feeling, it reminded me of that. That's like kind of the opposite in a way, where it's like
Oh
I'm
yeah,
gonna try to like force a fight, and it there is a world where it actually is a logical way to approach a scenario, but it is like that's the situation. It's like I'm trying to force a fight to feel better about myself. But if you as the opponent never allow them to even have that opportunity because your fundamentals are so good, then there's no in for them whatsoever. Because that is a
definitely.
legitimate way to get back in if you think that your opponent, like, you need to be gambling against your opponent because they're going to outplay you on the macro every
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you want to like
yeah.
reduce it to gambling. Yeah, that can make sense. But to do it for the sake of confidence is usually an error.
Oh, absolutely. So like if I was a coach for like one of these like teams that just qualified, you know what I mean? And I'm playing against like OXG and MXS, like I just naturally know that players will kind of tense up in matches. The entire week of practice leading up to that match, I'm telling them to intentionally swing through smokes, like do shit that doesn't make sense because these teams are so by the book, right? And you cannot let them play their own game against you because you will lose.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
This is something you said earlier, but it's something that I first heard from Sean Gares, where he said that and he said this like a couple of years ago. He's like, man, disrespecting utility in this game is so strong, and
Yeah.
and it's funny because people, don't take this information the wrong way. That doesn't mean just
Yeah,
run through every
exactly.
smoke, but you have to
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah.
understand that there are lots of spots, and if you are like a wizard that understands where these spots are, it's just game breaking for the opponents.
For sure. Because I think, and I'll just put it into like actual Valorant terms. Like, imagine somebody smokes you off on a certain angle where you're like opping oftentimes. Like, let's use Haven. I know Haven's not in the map pool, right? But we'll use Haven anyways. People will smoke like long, like by the bricks, by the orb attack. But if you decide you're going to walk through that smoke, you can tell your team that it's fake, and then you can, like, when you disrespect util, you find an opportunity for kills, number one, but also you can impact the rotations of your team and the speed of your rotation, so that like the enemy team is like they think that they've faked you out, but really you have all the information in the world. They go into a bomb site where you have 3 to 4 people and you mow them down. You know what I mean? So there's tons of value in disrespecting util, and I actually think like initiator util specifically is like the one item in the game that you can, well, there's a couple different ones, but like the main use case of initiator, or one use case of initiator util, is to disrespect enemy smokes or vision denial util, like viper walls and whatnot, to gain information to then dictate rotations around the map. So I think really good initiator players, like something that I try to focus on like private coaching with them is, okay, is there a way that you could have got information in this round, and then could you have dictated your rotations for your team better versus just saying that, oh, my flash didn't ping any. You know what I mean? Like, can you take it to the next step, right? So yeah, disrespecting util is super super important, right? But obviously there's a risk that goes along with that. Like sometimes you walk out of a smoke and there's 4 guys there, and then the round is over. You just
Hmm.
lost, right? So there's a natural. You need to have like kind of this gut feeling and the intuition that you're talking about. Like, okay, is this worth it right now? And maybe sometimes like if you're up 6-0, it doesn't make sense to take a certain risk because the team has not won any rounds against you. Don't feed them an in, don't give them an in to win the round. You know what I mean? Like you have to have this understanding, and also reading like, okay, if a team is not successful doing a certain thing against me, they're more likely to do something different. I mean, it's the famous Albert Einstein quote: "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results." Right? So like when teams are down heavily and you realize rounds 0 through 6 they were playing super super passive and static, guess what, rounds 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you should expect them to change something and do something different. And oftentimes if you have a good gauge of how teams are operating on a psychological level, you can kind of force them into mistakes, and gain the edge that way.
It's there's so many interesting things here. Like the the first thing as well about like trying to execute those spots that comes to my mind too is it reminds me of this thing that people say about like what is a man, and a man is someone who creates boundaries, tests boundaries, and
Okay.
enforces boundaries. And it reminds me
Yeah.
because it's what that really kind of means in a way to me as well is, and how you could maybe extrapolate it for it to make sense in this example as well, is that it's really about understanding with in that example it's yourself as a man, is the context. But if the context is something like Valorant, it's really about creating a structure and creating a system. and creating a system that makes sense where you create based on the principles of the game. Like you have like, okay, well, these are some boundaries that I understand. Okay, cool. But with your own play and the things that you don't know about your environment, because life is ultimately very complex. You got to test boundaries. You got to try stuff. You got to fuck stuff up.
Yeah.
And that's how you begin to understand how you can adjust the boundaries. And then once you created a system, you have to enforce the system that works. And so
Yeah.
as it relates to you or your team. And so it reminds me of that, because that is a process of learning. And what can happen, I think, and this is something that really, I think, when I started to like learn how to play poker, and I took that really seriously for quite a long time, this is where I saw this the most, where I'm like, okay, so if you look at everything in percentages, well, I mean, you actually can look at even if you in Valorant, yeah, you can't, you're not tracking all the data, you can't like
Give or take.
qualify everything. But in reality, like you can kind of estimate it. And that's what, going back to the intuition thing, that's when you have that good feeling, because you're like,
Yeah.
oh, this feels like good. Like, like if it's like a really good feeling, like, oh, I've really hit a timing, you're probably like, again, you couldn't describe how that decision makes sense, but that you have a timing that wins. And then you've hit it. Then like suddenly, yeah, you are behind that guy, or yeah, that guy's aiming in completely the wrong place. And so you have to test these things to get this sense. And so if you're too scared because you're like, I'm too scared of failing, or you push the smoke and yeah, there is like 4 people there, that's gonna suck, and you're gonna feel like you lose your team around. But you have to
Yeah.
understand, like, this is why if we go back into the whole like winning, what is the objective, winning the match, or is the objective in improving as a player? Well, what you're doing is you're limit testing. So yeah, you can kind of consciously like review the situation
Justify
afterwards
it.
and be
Yeah.
like, oh, well, yeah, my team had no map control, like nothing was going on in the map. Yeah, okay, that isn't a good time to push a smoke. So you can kind of like build a conscious element behind it
Yeah.
too. But yeah, like don't be afraid to like do things that seem crazy. Just make sure you have it relates to a system of some kind. Is my point, I guess.
To improve, you need to be comfortable making mistakes. Like losing, like it sounds cliche, but losing is learning, right? If you allow yourself to learn from it. That is the problem, is that people are just making decisions to make decisions, and like you said, there's no structure, right? So I don't know. I think you need to be able to take some risk in this game, but you also need to be able to, look at yourself internally, look at your play internally, and kind of be like, okay, I'm continuously not finding success doing this thing. Maybe it's not a good play. Maybe I should stop doing it. And guess what? If you stop doing it, you learn from it and you got some value, right? But if you're just mindlessly doing your thing, not learning from anything, what's the point, right? What's
Yeah, it's a lot of wasted time.
It's funny that you bring up the men with the boundaries. Men used to push boundaries. They used to go to war, but now I know men that lock Reina and don't come in ring. So how
Yeah,
far we've come,
yeah. Well, the funniest thing as well is that it's always like the irony to me is always so crazy that it's and this is why, like, I talk a lot about awareness and importance of self-awareness, because all these
Yeah.
a lot of these players will blame others as well, and try to find like a way to blame people, but like blaming others as opposed to like what and you described it earlier, like taking ownership is one, the best way to not learn anything, and two, it's like the most kind of, it's like the shittiest thing to do. It's like the weakest thing to do, I think, as a person. It's the weakest thing
Yes,
to do in that example, because it's,
I agree.
yeah. And so that's what I find is the
I
irony, because those are the individuals that present the most like strength or ego, but in reality it's actually very fragile. And that is why they're blaming other people, is because they're actually quite fragile. And which is, there's
Mhm.
nothing wrong with any of that, but it's like, it's just funny to like witness that. And obviously everyone has to go through their own journey of self-awareness. And hopefully, any of the times I've encountered some of those players, I hope that now, maybe a year on or
We're in a
whatever it
better
is,
place.
maybe they've grown up a bit and figured it out. And now they're like, good player, better comms, they take ownership in Radiant, whatever. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure
Couldn't
that's
agree
where
more,
they're
dude.
all at
Couldn't
right
agree
now.
more. Just the blaming and the cope, they go hand in hand. Like, that's really what it comes down to, right? Stop the blaming, stop the cope. I feel like the end of the day, in ranked, understand that it's not a depiction of your accurate skill. You can only control what you can control, but don't blame others for the shortcomings that you experience in rank. Like, you can understand that things might be going wrong, but at the end of the day, like, if you're losing, you're losing. It's not the end of the world. Are you making the right decisions? Are you setting yourself up for success by being, a person that reflects on the decisions that you're making. So that would be my advice to everyone.
Yeah, I'm speaking of the like the pro perspective. Who are the players that right now you're the like most hype on in terms of like whether it's just current like people on VCT teams or if it's like people that you think are underlooked maybe in tier two that didn't make it onto a bigger team like who's top of mind for you because as someone that you're not building a team right now but I know that you've probably got some names just float around in your head because you see stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I always felt like I've had like a good read on players. Like people that really stand out to me, like I think Narrate has done an insane job. Um, like first of all, he was playing like Neon, Jet, Raze, Duelist only, and now he's transitioned more into like a flex initiator, but also playing some Raze. So I'm really impressed with him. Um, I'm gonna step away from tier one. I'll go tier two. I think like there's so much, and it's crazy. I really wish that there were more. I almost wish that there was like a whole divisions for North America and an entire one for South America. You know what I mean? Because I
Yeah,
genuinely feel like you could have 10 to 11 insanely good teams like in the league. Like I could give you a list of like 30 players that I think are really really good. But just I'll stick with ones that I know or ones that really stand out to me. I think Verno, Redux are insane. I think Scuba, like honestly, the whole OXG is really, really good. The whole Moist team is very, very good as well. I know Fly had opportunities that he passed up. Stick with Moist. I think he was going to go to Vitality. Uh, so those guys are insane. I think if we deviate away from those teams and M80, I think I think Pancakes has been like one of my favorite players to be around. I think he's very, very, very skilled. I think he has a high skill ceiling. I know he's transitioning more into IGL, so I think he's someone to watch this season. Um, I think that another player that I really enjoyed being around was like honestly all of my OR guys I really, really liked, and I really think that we had a good shot of doing something special this season if we were still together. So like Icy, Rooney, uh, Pancakes, um, even some of the guys on the other teams, Jonah Six, Physic, Nilly. Let me think, dude. I'm trying to think. I think this Paint Val guy, if I don't know if you've seen
I
him,
haven't.
Paint. Oh my god, this
I
guy's
don't
a
think.
freak. He's insane. He's really good. He's on what team is he on? I'm looking at the thing. Oh no, he's on Thinking. He's on the Thinking squad. So I think
Yes, yes,
he's very solid. I don't know. There's so many. There's
yes.
so many players. I wish you
Yeah.
give me a heads up on this one because I would have wrote them down and because I'm gonna miss some. I'm gonna miss, and I feel bad about it.
Well, I can pivot
I,
into something else actually.
no, you're fine. Whatever.
Yeah, because well, I have something that I really wanted to ask you, which is like this is something that came from my community because they were, and unless you had something else you wanted to throw in there as well.
No, no, no. I'm good. I'm good. I really think like at the end of the day, a lot of the players that I've worked with have been amazing. I've built good relationships with them that I hope to carry on after coaching. Um, and I think like for the most part, like a lot of the tier two, the players in tier two, like challengers, regardless of team, you could kind of slot them in to tier one. And like I'm telling you guys, the gap between tier two and tier one is not that big. Really not.
Yeah.
Like you could slot any of these players. The big difference or the big thing separating them is opportunity. Like, I think you give almost any player in challengers the opportunity to scrim with this tier one team for a month, and I know that they will surprise.
Yeah,
There's so much skill.
I think that was like one of the things about like when you see players like even potentially, Com. I could have seen Com potentially missing a team in
Mhm.
VCT, or but like Vanity coming back in. Like it's not none of it. Like it's not free to be in to stay in VCT, and if you're out, oof, you could get stuck, man, because there's so many good players that can come in and play in tier one. There's so many good players.
And
Um,
yeah, yeah.
I
And
totally agree
real
with
quick,
you.
I think it's so important to to realize the amount of hunger that these challengers teams have, and also the amount of like kind of um I don't know, like misguided comfortability that the teams in franchising should have. You know,
Mhm.
you got to be as hungry as these challengers players to stay where you're at, or else I think they're really going to overtake you a lot of the time. as long as you can remove nepotism from the equation, I think that there's not a ton of like separation, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree, and again, and I totally support what you're saying, and I hope that we see it in the future with regards to the scene being expanded in terms, because the player pool is there to satisfy a much wider amount of, field of competition or competitive opportunities, whether that be leagues, tournaments, or whatever. So I hope that the scene gets that, because it's just, I feel like it's good for everybody. The players are there, people are hungry for it. So, but
Yeah.
with that said. So I had this question, and I'm curious on your take on it. And it was, you know, what? So the question is about Sentinel players. How they find value differently, and what makes a good Sentinel versus a great Sentinel player. People list Alpha and Less as top Sentinels, but they have drastically different styles. So I'm curious, what is your take on what makes a great Sentinel player, and do you have any comments on that difference of styles?
Yeah, I think obviously both players are like very, very mechanically skilled, like top of the line. I mean, I would even argue like top five in the world, maybe when it comes to just aiming. Like maybe less is not like as snappy as Alpha is, but in terms of like first bullet accuracy, this guy is just amazing, right? So I think like having really strong mechanics are super important for anchoring, right? I think also understanding like this is mainly for attack when you're lurking. I think less maybe does a better job of this than Alpha does actually is understanding how to create pressure without dying, you know? Like I think Les does a really good job on Viper playing away from the team completely on attack and creating a lot of pressure just naturally from being like people are like, oh, the Viper's here. Oh shit, I don't want to peek that guy. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure they do that with Alpha as well. But I think like he just naturally understands how to keep the other team from rotating away to the other bomb site. You know what I mean? So he takes a little bit more risk, I think, on these lurks, but also controls more space. Uh, but I think the other things that really make top of the line Sentinel play, and I'm not sure if these players are doing this or not, but I think like having really good awareness of reading the pre-round information and letting it dictate your setups. Like don't just default. Like first of all, you need to be able to run to your setup and put it down super quickly. That's super important. But also like every round when you die in the game, hold tab, look at the ults that the other team has, look at the money that they have, and let that dictate the way that you're going to set up, right? And I know tier one players are doing this, so more so speaking to those beneath that, but let the information that's one thing that Valorant gives you that CS doesn't, right? Like we talk about how similar the games are. Obviously, there's tons of different, you know, uh, more variation in Valorant, but the information, like you can see the money that the enemy team has, you can see the ults that they have or the ults close to. Those are key pieces of information that to dictate the way that you're set up, right? And then the last thing I'll say is like being able to like confidently tell your team to rotate away from you and let them know that you're anchoring or playing for retake, and then being able to stay alive and play for info when you need to versus taking fights, I think is probably one of the most important things.
All right. I mean, are there any other roles that you think people may not understand as well, or there are some like maybe misconceptions? Um,
Yeah. I think with controller, I think okay, like the key to good play on any agent is really going to come down to pre-round communication, in my opinion. In my opinion, like in this game, pre-round comms are the most important. So let's talk about controller real quick. Controller, and I'll use Ascent as an example for defense. Okay, like what you want to do as controller is you want to realize that your smokes are used to stop the enemy push. You want to use them to make the round infinitely harder for the enemy team, and make it easier for your team. So you need to have a good understanding of whether or not your teammates are positioned to fight the choke or if they are going to nest deeper back in sight. You know what I mean? So having a conversation with your players on the other side of the map and really having a global presence defense as controller is something that's important. You can't just default your one way A main smoke every single round and then not worry about your guys on B. Like I want to know what my B guys are doing. If they get rushed, like let's say the worst case scenario happens, they get rushed, I want to know what support smoke they have. How am I supposed to guess that? You can look at the radar and you can see that your player is falling back into back sight, but really use the pre-round time to communicate with them. Say, yo, are you guys going to try to lock down the choke, or are you going to nest back sight? If they're going to nest back sight, maybe I'll give you a one-way on stairs or a one-way on lane. And sorry for the non-Valorant people, but like figure out ways to best support your players by communicating that with them in the pre-round. I think is something that's super super important on controller, and something that probably isn't talked about the most, right? I think that people are just worried about throwing whatever smokes they need to on the exec, or a lot of times they don't have good smoke timings because they're not ready to smoke to support their team, right? They have the more selfish approach. So, and it really comes down to communication.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think I think I had my own way of like of describing it, but when I spoke with Mel,
Yeah.
she was saying, you know, like how much, you know, they you know, her team was working on the active comms and just having this distinction between passive and active comms. And I think like breaking comms down in these different ways is interesting. You know, just like relaying information, or like the active comm where you're like you earlier you were saying, oh, you know, do your 3-2-1s with people, like things where you're basically giving someone an action to do with you. But I think like the pre-round comms in of itself does deserve its own special place for sure, because I do feel like, especially in ranked, it's because in ranked, you know, you can kind of see what like people think are the most important things generally like as players, and there aren't that many players that really think about like the pre-round comming very much in a way that's that meaningful. Sometimes, like a lot of the time it might be passive, oh, I'm going to do this, or like, can you go over there? But when it comes to actually calling out like a more extended plan for the round, it doesn't usually go beyond just that play, because I feel like the pre-round comms, like, you know, like you're describing the controller, you know, util and so on, like that, you can go pretty deep into a round, and the idea of like what you want to get at, like up into like what value you want to get going into the mid round, or what situation you're trying to create going into the mid round with the controller, which maybe you can't do as much as the duelist, because the duelist, you know, you just want someone to support, to be aware of your play and maybe support your play. Whereas a controller, I feel like, can have a lot more, can dictate a lot more about, you know, what you're, cause especially because with controller util, if you're using it pre-round, in the early round, for example,
Yeah.
you're not going to have as much staying power in the late round to like defend, you know, to do retakes with, or like, so, you know, you're limited because you're trying to get value from it in the early round. So, and I don't think people focus on that very much.
Yeah. The only way you can really get value from it is if you know what your teammates are thinking, right? And like understanding that there are certain areas of the map that we don't need to fight for, so maybe we don't need to use a support smoke in a certain situation. If I know that my team is not fighting for an area, I don't need to smoke that off. I can save it and use it later and get value then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it all comes down to communication, and that's one thing that I see just from private coaching all the time. And a lot of it is ranked, but some of it is team scrims. Is there's not a lot of comms. Like I always think that in the pre-round, right, the most important thing that you should do, especially on defense, is plan for the worst case scenario to happen at your bomb site. So have a mini conversation with whoever you're playing with. Say, okay, if they rush us, let's do this. Because what you want is you don't want to be disjointed. You want to be together and, you know, be unified in the decision that you're making, because two bodies are better than one, two guns are better than one, two agents with util are better than one. You know what I mean? So you want to be doing things together, specifically on defense, because a lot of the times, if it's the worst case scenario and they're rushing you, they're doing it with at least 4 players, right? So you need to have 2 people counter you to the choke or ready to fight. So
One thing I've enjoyed from our conversation is like how we talk about the principles, like various acting concepts or principles in a given example. And this situation reminds me of this principle that, you know, became when I started casting in a Counter Strike, and in the early days, this became like really obvious to me really quickly, which is the sense that and this is like universal in anything competitive, like everything has a cost. And so if you throw a bit of util, well, that costs resources, and you now don't have that util. So you have to be interested in what the return is on all the util. And so if your util is getting thrown out and there's no return, then that's probably a util you shouldn't be throwing out there. And this as a
Yep.
concept, like just a general concept to think about, like when you're trying to analyze your own play, like where is the
Hmm.
value of what I'm doing here, or
Yeah.
like what is the reason I'm throwing out this util? That is like really powerful, and I think it kind of speaks to some of the stuff that you were talking about there too, because you've got to be pretty aware of that stuff. Because if you don't understand, because let's say you do something in the pre-round or the early round, that is, that you decide in the pre-round, if it doesn't go so well, you may have just dumped a bunch of util. So you're kind of at this like net disadvantage on util now towards the end of the round. So
Yep.
you have to consider that and think about, okay, well, I want to try to catch up somehow, so they don't get a util advantage when they are holding a site against me later or whatever it
Hmm.
might be.
Yep. And I think the other thing that's really important with that, there are a couple of things actually, is like if you can understand that a team has used a majority of their util and they haven't got value from it, good teams will realize that and they'll actually take more risk. Like they might go, like for example, let's say Icebox, they throw like a Viper, like attack side, they throw a Viper Molly, a Sova Dart, a Gecko Molly, and they get no damage or no value from it. They might actually, like when they go up to take the site, they might decide because there's no counter util that came in that they actually need to play a little bit more proactive and they need to poke, right? They need to poke for kills in post plant versus just sitting back nested because they understand that the other team has their full util kit to throw at them. You know what I mean? So understanding who's winning the natural util trade in the round is very, very important, and you should let it dictate the way that you play. Okay, and then also understand the way that it's going to dictate your enemy's play, right? And that's what makes you super hyper aware, and gets you a lot of free kills. But I also think the other thing too that you brought up at the beginning is like this concept of util trade and putting a financial number behind the util that you're throwing, um, is super, super important, right? So it shouldn't just only be about how much the util piece costs, but also it should be dependent on a couple other things. Like you should think about, let's take bind, for example. You think about bind, a lot of teams run double controller and they run single initiator. Teams that run single initiator, it's really hard to get things done if they don't have their full util kit, right? So if they like use their dog at the start of the round, people run Sky, right? If they use their dog, I'm willing to trade like my Raise Name or my Brim Molly for the dog because it makes the round harder for the enemy, right? Now that they don't have their dog anymore, they don't have as good info. It's harder for them to scale potentially, right? So we can stop them in the choke. So I'm willing to, it's this concept of util trade. The Molly is cheaper than the dog. Actually, the Molly is cheaper than the dog. And so like you can think about it in financial numbers, but you should also read like the team comp that the enemy team is running, and you should, certain pieces of util should hold more value depending on what comp against. So I think as an exercise for players, it's important when you get into ranked, you look at the top of your screen and you look at your comp and you look at their comp and you start to think like, okay, these pieces of util are super important to the success of the enemy team. If they throw this util, I'm going to trade my util in return. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Another example on bind would be like you play against Brimstone and Viper. If the enemy Brim on attack uses 2 smokes, I want to util dump. I want to trade the util for that because now they're only going to have 1 smoke later on in the round, which makes the site hits way harder. You know?
Yeah, and there's another example I can throw out there too, which
Sure.
for people, because just so that people don't get confused a little bit and understand the importance of what you're trading for. So like if let's say on Lotus on the defense you're playing the classic kind of 3-1-1 start where you maybe throw the raise nade or the paranoia and like the
Yeah.
various utility you throw to take control
Mm-hmm.
at the start of the round. By the way, this is actually another thing that's actually interesting about Valorant is that you have util that recharges too, and so like finding out what the spots are where you can kind of use that recharging util is really nice, and especially on Lotus it can come into play because if you are taking that space, that A main space aggressively, yeah, if they don't peek into it, well that's, yeah, they probably shouldn't peek into your util in most cases, and so even if you didn't get anything out of that in terms of kills, you've got a lot of space, and even if you don't necessarily hold that space, and there's a few mechanisms to kind of play with this idea. Now the other team, they have, it is up to them because that's a question mark for them to actually use utility to have to retake that space. So there
Yeah.
is actually a cost for them in retaking if they want to do it safely. And so this is always the question mark at the professional level. And I think actually Overpass on Counter for the Counter Strike people, this is an amazing map to actually discuss this dynamic, because on
Sure.
Overpass there is this dynamic where the CTs can have an opening where they get really deep control on the map, and
Mhm.
if the Ts actually want to retake control of everything, they actually can't have enough util to clear everything safely. So, like they just can't do it because there's so much space, and so it
Mhm.
becomes this question of how limited their options are. So this is a similar scenario whereby you're limiting the other team's options in terms of early timings, and also you can kind of play with it. You don't have to have anyone there. Like you can just rely
Exactly.
on the fact that they
Exactly.
have to throw util to, if you think it's a team that's going to have to make it safe. So
Mhm.
understanding like these different dynamics is really key, and then you can kind of cheat it a little bit as well, because you can have an agent that has the ability to get out. Like you got your own with the TP that can stand up
Yeah.
on top of the ruins, or
Rebel.
you
Yeah.
rubble,
Yeah.
yeah, or you've got your raise that can satchel away. So you get all these options to hold the space safely as well, to force them to then think, oh, can we take it for free? And then they see
Mhm.
that you have that position. Now they have to respect it, even if you only have one player, and you've just made it really safe because you have a player that can get out. So whilst they're trying to set up their retake util, you're out of there, and you've got the kind of rotation advantage because you've got the info really early. So you can see
Yep.
like this way that the kind of util trading can actually work out, and it becomes really interesting. So if you're like an analyst and you're like really nerdy about this stuff, you can get really deep on that.
For sure, for sure. That's a really good example that you brought up. And I've been sorry to plug my YouTube again, but I've been releasing these macro map guides where I talk about the different maps. I think I've only done 3 so far, but like a lot of the times what you guys need to consider is like, okay, how one choke point, does this choke point lead to giving me more options on attack? If it does, meaning it leads to 2 different hallways or allows me to split a bomb site or pivot, or if we use Lotus, for example, A main is super important because it gives me options to open the A door so I can wrap through tree and go through main. It allows me to break the baby door or hobbit hole or secret or whatever people call it to go A to B, right, with somebody lurking B. So because of that, by nature, it is the most important area of control for a lot of teams. And that's why people are util dumping on that choke, because they don't want to let you out of there. Because when you play defense, like I said earlier, you want to make the game as hard as possible for the opponent and as easy as possible for you. By limiting the amount of choke points or areas that a team can go, you make the round easier for yourself on defense. And on a map with 3 bomb sites, that is the key to success. You want them to only come through B main. You don't want to let them out A main, and you want them to just come through the C main. That's really the goal, the name of the game, right? So shutting down that A defense, setting somebody up on that A line, like your Omen or your Raze, that has some type of escape is really the key, right? Because then it allows you to rotate your other players into different areas of the map where now they can play to flood or play more supportive, and be there to rotate in time.
Awesome. Well, I mean,
Yeah,
Eric, we could definitely go on for an eternity about all of these
yeah,
things.
we
So I
could.
love that you're plugging your YouTube.
Sorry,
Is it
sorry.
no? Is there anything else that you want to plug, or did you provide the link? Did you say the link? I'm spacing out.
I did not say the link. It's just YouTube, whatever the youtube.com/Vapen FPS, APEN FPS. And yeah, that's about it. And then my Twitter is the same thing. If you guys want to shoot me a follow, I'd really appreciate it. Um, been doing some good growth over the last month, so I'm excited to keep it going, and hope to see some of you guys there.
Yeah, rumor has it you are starting a Discord now, that you are getting more traction with all the
Yeah,
content.
yeah, I agreed. I set a goal for 1,000 subs, and I hit it in, I don't know. It's been almost a month or so, and I said I'd put together a Discord. But I'll be honest with you, I'm not good at setting up Discords and optimizing that, and I have no idea how I'm going to do it. So I need to brainstorm that and get that going. But yeah, eventually that is my goal: set up some type of Discord, um, and just create a solid community where people can learn, and people have access to content.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank
Yeah.
you for the chat. It was really fun. Like, being able to be honored to be the first to record a podcast with you.
Yeah,
That's been
man.
great.
Thanks so much for having me on. I had a great time too. It's always effortless, conversation flows. So
Awesome.
thanks for having me, dude.
Absolutely. Okay. Cheers. I'll speak to
Well,
you soon, no doubt.
all right, sounds good. Take care.